Hey there, my 5 faithful listeners, and anyone who randomly stumbled upon this episode. My name is Lydia, and this is the Lydia Todd Pod. It's probably not a good idea to start a podcast because your last name rhymes with pod. But I'm here anyways. From spontaneous trips to special guests to deep spiritual conversations and everything in between, expect inspiration, stories, and plenty of laughter. Grab a glass of milk, settle in, and let's dive into the episode. Until we had this at camp, I don't think I had ever read past the first 4 chapters of Daniel.
Yeah, the major division is after chapter 6, and you get all of the stories that you hear growing up are 6 and before. You've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the lion's den, and the king's meat, and you got all of those things that you always hear. Chapter 7 on almost never gets discussed in a public setting because it's difficult. A lot of good stuff there though too.
Is there any kind of disclaimer that you want to give about any interpretation that's going to happen?
So these interpretations that we're going to look at, I'm not dogmatic about them. I don't believe it has to be absolutely this way. There are several views, and I have several friends that take different views, and I stand with my friends. There are several ways to interpret Daniel and not violate the text, and we will only know absolutely for sure exactly which one it is in the end. And that's okay because the different interpretations come through history and come through, okay, which part of history exactly is this talking about? And then it all comes together at Christ. And every single interpretation of this that is even close to accurate, it comes down to the same interpretation of when it gets to Christ. And that's what really matters to us. The whole point of these visions and the whole point of these things were to lead Israel to realize that there's going to come a time when Israel is no longer and there is an everlasting kingdom. And that's the one constant that you see through all of these is the everlasting kingdom. Regardless of how the history relating to these is interpreted, the everlasting kingdom is always the same, and it's God's kingdom, it's the church, and it's when Christ came, and all of that is accurate and there. To feel like you can't be friends with somebody because they interpret some of these difficult visions in Daniel differently than you is taking Christianity to a point it was never meant to be.
Yeah. I don't think that anyone I know would unfriend me from a discussion on the book of Daniel, but it's good to set that out there in advance.
Right.
The book of Daniel is one of my favorite books.
It's one of my favorite too because he was named after me.
Oh, yeah. Daniel is one of my favorite books, but it's only one of my favorites, or it only became one of my favorites when we studied it in depth through the rest of the book. I'd always liked the story of Daniel, and I'd always admired Daniel's faith because there's so many times where he stands up, does what's right in such a difficult environment to do that, and he is rewarded sometimes by the people, and oftentimes God will work things for his good, even like a physical in the moment good and not just an eternal good. And so it's really cool to see how Daniel works for God and God is always there with him. But there's a whole part about Daniel being a prophet, and he's in the book of prophets for a reason that I guess most people haven't looked into. I'm sure that almost everyone has heard referenced the verse in, I don't know what chapter. It's verse 44, I think.
244.
244?
244.
Is that the kingdom one? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the kingdom one. So I think everyone has heard referenced 244, and that might be the only prophecy part that they know. I feel like that's the only one that I had heard multiple times before the study, but even then I didn't really know the context. I was just like, oh, Jesus' kingdom was prophesied about in Daniel, and that was all I knew.
Right.
So introduce us to the book of Daniel. Daniel?
The book of Daniel. So one interesting thing that I've noted about the book of Daniel in going through it this very last time is the timeline. I've never looked real closely at the timeline. You hear that this is in the first year of so-and-so or the 8th year of so-and-so, and that usually means very little to us. But if you actually go back and look at it, you have all of these stories in the beginning of Daniel that start when he's very young, when he's first there in captivity, and you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and all those, and then there's about a 60-year divide between the stories. And when Daniel's thrown into when he interprets the last dream that Babylon's going to fall, the night of the big party, the many, many tekel upharsin, and thrown in the lion's den shortly thereafter, he's an old man. He's somewhere between 75 and 80 years old when they take him and throw him in the lion's den. And there's like a 60-year gap, or 55 or 60-year gap there in the book of Daniel where essentially nothing happens. And then after the lion's den, you come into chapter 7, which begins these visions that Daniel has. And it goes back in time to start the visions. So this is not chronological order. This is not Daniel as an old man receiving all of these visions all at once. This goes way back in time to several years back and catches up to where he is then. Timeline's important. There's a lot of books in the Bible that are not chronological, and if you try to study them thinking they're chronological, you're going to study and you're going to find discrepancies that are there, but they're told like we tell stories, not like we write stories. And so when we write stories, we write everything in order and it's chronological, and it all makes sense to us because that's how we're used to it. When we tell stories, you'll notice, you pay attention to it sometime. You'll see somebody and they'll tell you stories like this happened and then this happened and then this has happened. Oh yeah, and back here this happened, because they forgot to tell you before. And so the Bible in its chronology, that's right, that's the word, right?
Yeah.
The Bible in its chronology is oftentimes not exact, and Daniel's one of those books. The first of the visions that we're going to look at, the first of the things we're going to look at, is actually chapter 2 that you brought up and talked about, because while it's not as symbolic as the rest of them, and not as controversial for sure as the rest of them, it gives a launch pad for the rest of them, because these visions that he's dealing with, it's the same four kingdoms all the way through that he's dealing with and that he's talking about. Now, the reason it goes back in time, and the reason part we know it goes back in time, is because it tells us is such and so year of the king, and so it obviously went back in time. But also because if you're dealing with the four kingdoms, it has to go back in time, because by the time you get to Daniel 6, the nation of Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon, the world power is gone. It is no more. Cyrus has come in and defeated them, and the Medes and the Persian are now the world power. And so if everything was chronologically correct, then by the time you got to chapter 7, you would have only been dealing with 3 world powers instead of 4. But it does go back in time. So you see Daniel and you see these dreams. One thing to note about these dreams is, I've had some crazy dreams. I have woke up in the middle of the night with these dreams and thought, okay, this is absolutely insane. Where did that come from? Daniel had no question where it came from. It was a vision, it was a dream, but I believe it to be different than just seemingly random dreams that we might have. This wasn't last night's pizza that gave Daniel these dreams, and Daniel knew that. Daniel knew these were important. He knew they were from God, and he knew they were specifically being delivered to him. Another thing to note is this one in chapter 2 is an interpretation. Look at 2 and verse 26 is where we're going to start.
The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?"
Whose dream?
The king's.
It was the king's. This one, as it starts out, the same 4 kingdoms, a symbolic dream as well. And this one wasn't even Daniel's dream. The fulfillment of these prophecies is not just limited to one person in the dreams that he had and saying, this is what the dreams mean. This was the king's dream here, and Daniel interpreting the king's dream, but the same interpretation that you see from the rest of them. And as you'll see, this dream that the king had in verse 27, that none of the wise men could do it. And so Daniel and the power that God gave him was clear that it was more than what any of the other wise men had. And as he interprets this dream, you see the fulfillment of what is to come, what is supposed to be. Verse 31 is where the interpretation begins. He says, "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image whose splendor was excellent and stood before you, and its form was awesome. And the image's head was of fine gold, and its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while the stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." And so what you have here is you have Daniel telling the king his dream, because the king wanted the dream told and interpreted. And so as Daniel tells this dream, he tells this dream of this great image that is seen, the head of gold, the breast and arms of silver, and the belly of thighs of brass, and so on. And then he gives the interpretation starting in verse 36. Daniel says, "This is the dream. Now we will tell you the interpretation before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory." I think it's notable that he started out showing respect to the king. Who was Nebuchadnezzar as king?
A person who enslaved a bunch of people.
Enslaved a bunch of people, including Daniel.
Yeah.
And so you have all of the Jews that are there, or all of the ones that are there, are enslaved by Nebuchadnezzar, and he's not a godly man, and he's not a good king, and he makes so many mistakes in his leadership, but Daniel still recognizes him. You are King of Kings. Nebuchadnezzar, regardless of what kind of person he was, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the world power of that time. Nobody challenged Babylon at this point because Babylon was the nation to be. But you notice Daniel reminds him and tells him also, you're King of Kings. You are King of Kings because God gave that to you. And so Daniel, having a full realization of Nebuchadnezzar is king of the world power of Babylon because God put him there. Does that make Nebuchadnezzar a good king?
No.
No, not at all. Nebuchadnezzar was a horrible king. Was God using Nebuchadnezzar to accomplish his will?
Yeah.
Always. And so sometimes we struggle with respecting leaders for who they are, but the reality is God's in control. They're there for a reason, and we need to have respect to them for the position that they had. Daniel had this great respect for Nebuchadnezzar when he was a slave in Nebuchadnezzar's nation. Verse 38, he says, "And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and he has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold." The first interpretation of the vision of this image is absolute and certain. Who is the head of gold in this image?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Daniel makes that absolute. It is no doubt. He is King of Kings. He is King of Babylon. God has made him this King of Babylon. And when you look at Babylon, Babylon was world power for about 1,700 years, Nebuchadnezzar being a small part of that. But it cannot legitimately be argued that this head of gold is anything but the Babylonian Empire because of the statement made there. Now, as you get into the rest of them, why would Daniel not be quite as clear as to who they were? Notice 39, he says, "But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another, a third kingdom of bronze that shall rule over all the earth." Why didn't he list them out?
Were there multiple options at that point?
Did God know?
Yeah.
And Daniel speaking what God tells him to, why not list them out? Why not say the Medes and the Persians are going to come, and then Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire is going to come, and then the Romans are going to... Why not spell that out?
I don't know. You tell me.
Does God ever spell out future events like that?
I'm not sure. I can't recall one, but I don't know that there isn't one just because
Okay.
I can't remember.
I don't exactly know the reason. I'm asking questions that I don't fully know the reason. Why God wouldn't just say, this is this kingdom, this is this kingdom, this is this kingdom, but he didn't here.
It could be a way to, because some people think that, I guess on the stance of free will, that if God knows something ahead of time, that he forces it to happen. But if he doesn't say that specific thing is going to happen yet, then it seems more like it was by choice.
That's a really... we need to do that sometime. We need to do a free will discussion. Does God knowing it ahead of time change the fact that it's free will?
No. But I think some people think that.
And that's hard for us, and we need to discuss that sometimes because that's a really cool, really good discussion to have. When you get to the bottom of it, and we'll go there sometime, but when you get to the bottom of it, ultimately, God knowing does not change the fact that free will is still there. And it doesn't because God's outside of time. So we're bound by time. We don't know exactly what the future is going to hold. We're going to make decisions, and how are those decisions going to affect our future? We don't fully grasp that, fully understand, but yet we make decisions. And some of our decisions are based on past decisions. Some of our decisions that we're going to make are not the best decisions and not right decisions. But as those decisions come into play, we see it play out in a timeline. God's outside of time. God created time, and he did so in creation, and it's part of our world that he has given to us. But yet you have God who outside of time sees the beginning and the end and the middle all at once. It wasn't an accident, and Bible's clear about this. It wasn't an accident that God sent Jesus when he did. He says when the fullness of time was come. And so when God created the world, he knew immediately, this moment right here, this is the perfect time. That's when Jesus is coming. That's when he's going to send Jesus. But on the same note, he didn't have to sit around and wait on it either, because he's outside of time. It just is. But that doesn't change the fact that we have free will through the whole timeline that we're facing, because we are limited by time, because he gave that to us and made that part of our world. And we still make decisions. But again, that's a good study we'll go into at some point.
Yeah, we'll do that not next time, but maybe next time.
Next time. Cool. All right, so we have this image that's representative of Daniel has told him of 4 kingdoms that are coming. Nebuchadnezzar is the first one. He's the head of gold. The next one in verse 39, it says another kingdom will arise after you inferior to yours, and then another that is a third. So the one that is inferior, the king that rose to power after Babylon fell, was the Medo-Persian Empire. It was in power from about 538 to 533. You have Darius, who was one of the rulers of the Medo-Persian Empire, and the leadership there is quite complicated, because the Medo-Persian Empire was it was an alliance between a bunch of kings, and so while you had different leaders that were there, you had multiples at one time, unlike you would have in a normal kingdom. So you had different leaders over different regions and such like. Darius was called king, and he was one of the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire. You also have Cyrus, who was one of the leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire. Interesting thing to look at. Let's look at Ezra 1, verses 1 through 4, as we're talking about the Medo-Persian Empire.
Ezra 1, 1 through 4. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God Israel. He is God, which is in Jerusalem. And whoever is left in any place where he dwells, let the men of his place help him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, besides the free will offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem.
Okay, so you have Ezra talking about Cyrus here, and Cyrus is king of Persia. The Medo-Persian Empire is still not a godly kingdom, still not a good kingdom. The children of Israel, by default, were in captivity to the Medo-Persians when they conquered Babylon. So you have Cyrus, who is not a good king, who decides, Israel needs to go back and build this house, build the house of God. And so he lets them go and lets them build. And it describes here that the spirit, his spirit was stirred by God to do this. Look at Isaiah 44 and verse 28 as well. So Cyrus, and a study of Cyrus and the prophecies surrounding him, to me, are some of the most convincing that the Bible has to be from God.
44:28, Isaiah.
So you have God speaking here. God is going down describing all of these different things, and one of the descriptions he has is verse 28. Go ahead.
Who says of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, You shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid.
So you have God who says of Cyrus that he is my shepherd. Was Cyrus a good king?
No.
No. He did a few good things, but overall he was a wicked king. So you come down to the very next chapter 45, and it says, Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him, and to loose armor of kings, and to open before him the double doors, so that the gates would not be shut. What did God call Cyrus?
His anointed.
His anointed. Why was Cyrus king?
Because God put him there.
God put him there. It is Cyrus that's going to do this. Cyrus is going to accomplish it. You can go all the way down through verse 8 or 9 here in this chapter, and all of this is discussing what God is going to do for Cyrus and what's going to happen. Now, the interesting thing is, Isaiah prophesied this before Babylon was a world power. So you have several hundred years before this ever came to be that God is talking about Cyrus, saying Cyrus is going to be king, and Cyrus is his anointed, and Cyrus is the one who's going to send them back to rebuild the house in Jerusalem.
Was Cyrus alive at this point?
No, no,
Okay, that's so cool.
no. It's at least at least 150 years before Cyrus, and he's naming him by name.
Wow.
With the image in Daniel, God told Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, you are the head of gold. He didn't name the others. He didn't have to. He didn't have to, because you look back through history, it's quite plain who the other three world powers following Babylon are. And not only that, he'd already prophesied about them in other places.
Hmm.
And while he didn't name all of the leaders by name, Cyrus was named by name and very clearly named by name. And again, that's a study of Cyrus is one of the most convincing there's no way this could happen without God. So you got another king that'll arise that is after the Medo-Persian Empire, Brass. Brass is strong. The Medo-Persian Empire fell to the Greeks. The Greeks were the world power from 333 to 146. Any guesses who the main leader of the Greeks was?
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great. Quite a few prophecies in the Bible about Alexander the Great, though I don't believe he's ever named. 40 through 43 of Daniel 2, you've got the fourth kingdom, 2 verse 40. So the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as the iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, the kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom will be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with the ceramic clay. And as the toes and the feet were partly iron, partly clay, so shall the kingdom be partly strong and partly fragile. And as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix. So you have this fourth kingdom. Fourth kingdom is going to be as strong as iron, breaking in pieces, partly strong, partly broken. The fourth kingdom is dealing with Rome. If you follow the world powers through, Rome follows the Greeks as a world power. They were there from about 44 BC to 455 AD. Augustus Caesar is considered the most powerful Roman empire by most. He took power when Julius Caesar was killed by Brutus.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Remember the play most people study in high school? Yeah, but it's talked about and discussed in the Bible. That's the cool thing. I really wish I had a ancient history class that tied everything back to references in the Bible, because that would be just phenomenal. So you have Rome as this iron kingdom. It's strong for over 100 years. Nobody challenged it for over 100 years, but yet Rome was a melting pot for many nations and eventually became a weak nation and eventually fell. You have those four kingdoms. Then you have the final kingdom as it is described in Daniel. This is the one that you were referring to before that everybody knows about. Verse 44, it says, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Forasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron and the bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass after this. The dream is certain, the interpretation is sure. Who sets up this kingdom?
God.
How long will it last?
Forever.
Who will it be left to?
To other people. Oh, wait, no. Will not be left to other people.
Not be left to other people. That's significant. Name a kingdom that's not left to other people other than God's kingdom.
There's not one, because they're always taken over.
The king dies. At the very best situation where a king lives his entire life and is king his entire life, eventually he gets old and dies, and it's left to someone else. Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, it was not even left to his children, if there were any. It was left to his 4 generals. And so, as strong as Alexander the Great was, and probably one of the strongest world powers that ever existed, his kingdom was temporary because it was split 4 ways when he died, and each of the generals took one section of his kingdom. This kingdom's not going to be left to other people. You have God who rules it, God who rules it forever, and it won't ever be destroyed, and it won't ever end, and it won't ever be left to other people. What is the significance of without hands? 45.
It's imperishable?
Okay. If it's cut without hands, could man have done it?
No.
It's by God's power. It's not man that makes this nation. It's not man that builds this nation. And you look at all of the other kingdoms, and as they are historically recorded, it is attributed to each of the world leaders for giving the kingdom that they're part of, giving them their power and giving them their strength. The book of Daniel shows us it was God that gave them their power and strength, but there's no question with God's kingdom because it wasn't established or built or started by man. It was established and built and started by God, and he still is king.
Yeah, and I've always read that part and thought that means that it's not physical. Like it's a spiritual kingdom.
And that too. Right. So it's referenced that way several times throughout prophecy and several times in the New Testament that the kingdom would be a kingdom made without hands. So then we skip a few chapters and we come to chapter 7. Anything else about chapter 2?
I don't know if this means anything, but next to those verses, I wrote 2 Corinthians 5:1.
Yeah, that is made without hands in the New Testament.
Oh, okay. 2 Corinthians 5:1. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Yeah.
It's an eternal kingdom that's not made without hands. Even going on there, he says, for in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. Spiritual. Right? It's eternal, it's made by God, it's spiritual kingdom, and it's something that we are to desire and to look for. So, yeah, I have trouble thinking that Paul didn't have Daniel 2 run through his mind as he's working through this. And obviously inspired by God and given the message by God, but Paul knew the Old Testament too.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so as the kingdom without hands, there's some references also in other places. Let's look at Isaiah 8 and verse 14. This being prophecy here, it says, he will be as a sanctuary, but a stumbling stone and rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, and as a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. How many times was Jesus referred to as a stone or as a rock?
Multiple times.
This being one of those.
Especially in Peter.
Right. Isaiah 28, verse 16.
28:16. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion a stone for a foundation, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not act hastily.
Same idea, the prophecy about the cornerstone that is coming, and tied back to it in 1 Peter 2, verse 4. It says, coming to him as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Therefore it is also contained in Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect and precious, and he who believes in him will by no means be put to shame. Where's he quoting from?
My guess is Isaiah.
It's Isaiah, we just read, isn't it? Yep. Acts 4 and verse 11. 11 and 12.
Acts 4:11 and 12. This is the stone which was rejected by you builders, which has become the chief cornerstone. Nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved.
Who's the stone?
Jesus.
Christ. Matthew 21:42. Here's an interesting one because Jesus ties it back to himself. It's not the apostles doing it, it's Jesus. It says, Jesus said unto them, have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So Jesus asking them, haven't you ever read this prophecy? And tying it back to himself as being that chief cornerstone. We've got several references, and when it talks about the stone in Daniel, the stone that's cut without hands, the stone that will fill the earth and be the whole kingdom, he's telling us that in the days of the Roman Empire, this is when this is going to happen, that Jesus is going to come at that time. I'm sure Daniel struggled with some of this, because while he knew Babylon was the first kingdom, I don't think he had a clue who the other three were at the time. And it would be a struggle for me to know all of those prophecies and to know I'm never even going to live long enough to see them. And I'm sure Daniel had that realization too. It's like it's not like these kingdoms are going to fall in the next few years. This is a long-term prophecy that is being given. But he had those prophecies. He had them from God, and he delivered them for a reason. And it wasn't just for Nebuchadnezzar. It was for us that we have them.
Yeah.
Okay, Daniel 7. We're skipping over all of the stories that they're some of my favorite stories, building faith stories, but we're skipping over those to go to the more symbolic parts. Daniel 7 and verse 1, it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. We have a timestamp. Who is the world power at this point?
Belshazzar?
Belshazzar, he's king of Babylon. At the end of chapter 5, 5 or 6, you have, it's 5. End of chapter 5, you have Babylon falling to Cyrus. You have the Medes and the Persians coming in, taking over. Babylon was never a formidable kingdom again. And so this going back in time as far as, like we talked about, as far as the timeline goes, you have Babylon as world power. You have Daniel having these dreams and visions, and as he has these dreams and visions, he is confused by them, troubled by them, but he also gets an explanation for them. Verse 2, it says, Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Now, there's several times when sea is referring to people. You see this in Daniel, or sorry, in Revelation chapter 12, you see that where the sea is obviously the people and referring to the nations. Many times throughout Old Testament prophecies, the sea is used like it'll talk about a sea of people who attacked another nation, and it's not talking about the sea, it's actually talking about the people. And you have the same thing here. When we think of four winds, what do we think of?
The whole earth.
Okay, so the entire earth, and usually being used representing the power of God. So the power of God here is stirring up the great sea, is stirring up the people. So you see God working in the kingdoms of men here. Verse 3 it says, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, each different from the other. Let's read through this and then we'll go through the explanation as he gets to it. It says, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings, and I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, was raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise and devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. And it was different from all the other beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. And I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom the first 3 horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So you have this vision here, these 4 beasts that Daniel is given. As we go through and look at them, and some explanation comes a little bit later, but as we go through and look at them, the beasts are the 4 world powers. It's the same 4 world powers that he's already dealt with. The first is like a lion there in verse 4, like a lion with eagle's wings. Jeremiah 4 and verse 7, it's interesting how Jeremiah refers to Babylon. Here in talking about Babylon, he refers to Babylon as a lion. The lion has come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of nations is on his way. He has gone forth from his place to make your land desolate, and your cities be laid waste without inhabitants. We look at the context here in Jeremiah, and he's talking about Babylon, referring to Babylon as a lion. Don't think that's coincidence. Don't think that's coincidence when you have multiple prophets referring to a kingdom in the same way. Ezekiel 17 and verse 3.
17:3. And say, thus says the Lord God, a great eagle with large wings and long pinions, full of feathers of various colors, came to Lebanon and took from the cedar the highest branch.
Any guess who he's talking about in the context?
The eagle?
Eagle. The symbolism here is referring to Babylon as well. So you've got Babylon being referred to by multiple prophets from different places and different times as a lion and as an eagle. Daniel here describing him as a beast that is like a lion with eagle's wings. Daniel says there in verse 4, he lost his wings and he stood as a man. Babylon became less aggressive in her later years, like most world powers did, which is usually what led to their fall. Some of them were too aggressive, like the Greek Empire. Not described as being standing like a lion, but standing like men. The representation being like a man. When Babylon went through excavation and stuff, they went back through and looked through Babylon and have gone through the things that were there. They found winged human figures that had a human body and wings and the head of a lion. And so they've found actual physical representations from Babylon, from the destruction of Babylon, that would represent what Daniel is describing here in chapter 7 and verse 4.
Hmm. I think I've seen some of those in like the Louvre.
Oh, I'm sure you have, yeah. Yeah, like these beasts are seen all through history, but they are also representative because people have read this and said, "Ooh, I want to make that." Some pictures and some images I've seen are just phenomenal. Your mind can run wild when you're reading this, and we'll get to it in a minute. But you have the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then the one that's just the beast. It's like it couldn't even be represented by a animal that we would understand. It just calls it the beast. And so you want to talk about imagination running wild, it could have been anything. But again, this is a vision Daniel has. This is a dream. This is something he sees. And so what exactly it is doesn't really matter. It's what it represents.
Yeah, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the OG one. Whenever it says that he was made to stand on 2 feet like a man, that makes me think about Nebuchadnezzar and what happened to him. Do you think that there's any tie to that there?
Very possibly. I'm not sure. Obviously, he lifted himself up with pride. He's like, look at what I've done. Look at how big of a kingdom I've made. And then he's cast down, but he's restored again, too. So,
Mm.
I don't know.
Because he was a goat and then he was risen back up like a man.
Right. Yeah. Second beast in verse 5. Second beast is like a bear, is raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and said, arise and let us devour much flesh. When you look at the Medo-Persian Empire, the Persian Empire was stronger than the Medes. They were an alliance, they worked together, they were a world power together, but the Persians were always stronger than the Medes, even though they worked together. So you have the representation of this bear being raised up, being stronger on one side. Had 3 ribs in her mouth. The 3 great conquerors that the Medo-Persian Empire made were Lydia, Egypt, and Babylon, and all 3 were conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. You really struggle to find even a resemblance of a fourth there that they might have conquered. And so when you look at Lydia, Egypt, and Babylon being the 3 big ones that they completely conquered, it becomes quite evident that the 3 ribs that it had in his mouth were representative of those 3 that it conquered when it was in power. Verse 6, you have the third beast, a leopard. What do you think of when you think of a leopard?
Something fast, stealthy.
Okay, leopards are very fast. What about a leopard with 4 wings?
I don't know. Haven't seen one of those.
I haven't seen one of those either. Wings are almost always symbolic of speed,
Hmm.
and a leopard being symbolic of speed as well. If you look back through history and you look at the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great, Alexander the Great was able to conquer land, conquer kingdoms at a rate probably faster than any other world power ever has. During the time he was reigning in the Greek Empire, he basically conquered almost all the known world in about 10 years. Went from being not the world power to basically conquering almost all of the known world in that 10 years. And so it was very fast in what he was able to do. Now, one of the downsides, he did quite overextend himself to where he wasn't able to protect the entirety of it at the end, but very strong, very fast there for some time. Had 4 heads. Alexander the Great had 4 great generals that followed him, and when Alexander the Great died, each of those generals took a portion of his kingdom. And so now you don't have one very strong, powerful kingdom, you have 4 smaller kingdoms that are being ruled by Alexander the Great's generals that followed after him. Verse 7, you have the fourth beast. It says, after this I saw in night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with his feet. And it was different from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. So when you look at this beast, again, it doesn't attribute it to an animal that we would know, that we would understand. Even the others are quite symbolic, because when you talk about a lion with the body of a man and wings, that's something we can somewhat grasp, but never seen one. Leopard with 4 wings, never seen one. And all of these are things that we can grasp but don't fully understand. This one I believed to be so different that we couldn't even grasp what it was, and we're not intended to, or it would have told us, you know. Dreadful, terrible, strong. Iron teeth symbolize the strength in which it had. It broke in pieces. It stamped whatever's left with his feet. It was different than the other 3 beasts, and it had 10 horns. 10 horns become very significant. Let's get verse 8 along with it. You want to read verse 8?
I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words.
If you follow this through in the symbolism involved here, you're dealing with Rome. Rome is this fourth world power. It's the same as the other 4 world powers earlier in Daniel, and I believe they're more clear there so that they will be clear to us here as he goes through the world powers. 10 horns represent the 10, and if you follow back through history, they line up perfectly. The 10, can't think of it, the Roman leaders, what are they called? They're not kings.
Emperors?
Emperors, yeah. The 10 Roman emperors, sorry. The
It's
10
okay.
Roman emperors that are there, it follows. And then you have another one that comes, and all of this taking place about the time of the book of Revelation, and also talked about in Revelation. We'll get to that more in a minute. Verse 9, you have the Ancient of Days. Put a bookmark in this because we're coming right back to Rome. Verse 9, you have the Ancient of Days. He said, I watched until thrones were in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated, and his garment was white as snow, and his hair, the hair of his head, was pure like wool. His throne was a fiery flame, and its wheels a burning fire. The Ancient of Days, who do you think of when you think of the Ancient of Days?
God.
Think of
Jesus.
God. His garment white as snow, like pure wool, showing his righteousness. What do you think of when you think of fire?
Well, I think of 2 different things. I think of the baptism of fire, and then I think of hell.
Okay. I believe this to be representative of judgment, because he tells them judgment is coming here. A fire stream issued and came forth before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. His court was seated, and the books were opened. Why were the books opened?
Time for judgment.
You think of any other place where the books were opened? So in the book of Revelation, it describes judgment as the books were opened, and then another book was opened, which was the book of life, and they were judged. So the same symbolism of the books being open, representing judgment, is dealt with in Revelation as well. You have the Son of Man talked about in verse 13. He says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
He's back to paralleling with chapter 2, isn't he?
Hmm.
So again, like I talked about, there is some discussion over the exact interpretation of some of the symbolism that is there. But when you come down to the end of it, when you come down to the one like the Son of Man, when you come down to the stone cut without hands, it's all quite evident what he's talking about. And he's talking about the church, he's talking about Jesus, and he's talking about the things leading up to that. So you have all of this, and in dealing with this symbolism, do all of the details matter?
No. I mean, they matter in the sense that they're true, and if if they do stand for something, or if he told them to us, then it's supposed to reassure us, like when we figure out what they mean, what the truth is. But as long as you get the big picture, then you don't have to get all the details.
So he gave them to us for a reason, right? So every time I go through studying this, something else becomes evident to me that I had never seen before. It's like, oh wow, yeah, that makes sense. And a lot of it is because as we study through history, we start to see, God knew exactly what was going to happen. God knew all the details when he wrote it down. And so when we don't have a full grasp exactly of what happened in history, and as we study the history and we study what God has said about it, and it begins to mesh and it begins to align, and it does so more and more the more we study it. He gave us the details for a reason, but ultimately the main important thing that we get out of these is that God knew exactly what was going to happen. God told Daniel exactly what was going to happen, and that is what happened. And all of this is leading to Jesus. The entirety of the book of Daniel is pointing to and leading to Jesus. So it's written at a time when God's people were in captivity. They were in captivity at Babylon and then in captivity in the Medo-Persians, and they're not even in Jerusalem, but God's in control. They're not even in where they're supposed to be or able to worship exactly like they're supposed to and all this stuff, but God is still in control. And ultimately, as you read through it, they were there for a reason. Revelation 13, 1 and 2.
Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority.
So you have a beast. You have a beast that with the 10 horns and 10 crowns. The beast in Revelation, or beast in Daniel had 10 horns as well. You have the leopard, the bear, and the lion mentioned in verse 2. But they're in the opposite order of what they were in Daniel. Why would they be in the opposite order?
We had talked about this before, because when John writes this, it had already happened, so he's like looking backwards in history.
The lion, the bear, and the leopard had already happened when John writes this. So it makes sense that he, in dealing with the beast, which is Rome, and that's who was the world power at this time, it makes sense that John would look back and refer to them in the reverse order, even though it's the same animals and the same beasts. Now, Book of Daniel outlines who those kingdoms are and leads those kingdoms up to the Roman Empire, and does so multiple times throughout the Book of Daniel. The Book of Daniel is priceless in interpreting what Revelation is talking about. Revelation is dealing with the Roman Empire, dealing with those 10 horns, those 10 emperors, and you go to chapter 17 and verse 10 of Revelation, and you have a similar picture here.
17:10. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time.
Okay, why 7 kings here instead of 10? Daniel said 10.
Is this a different part of the prophecy? Well, in verse 12 it says 10 horns.
Yep. So he deals with 7 there in verse 10. He talks about 10 in verse 12. Why the difference?
I don't know. It says that there's 7 heads and 10 horns.
So back in Daniel 7, you have the 10 horns, but then you have another little horn. Look at verse 19. He said, I wish to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceeding dreadful, with its teeth of iron, its nails of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. The 10 horns which were on its head, and the other horn which came up before, which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke great pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellow. What happened to 3 horns?
It fell.
3 fell. How many does that leave?
7.
7, right? So in Revelation you have him talking about the 7 horns and referring to them as part of the 10, but Daniel told us that 3 of them were going to fall. He makes war with the saints there also in verse 21. He said, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So you have this beast that has power, this beast with the 10 horns, the 10 emperors that were going to come, and then they were going to have power for a short time. Do you remember what happened in the days of Rome and how they treated Christians?
There wasn't always persecution, but under some emperors there was lots of persecution, and other times they were just kind of neglected.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't always persecution. There's only about 2 of them that were really horrible at persecuting Christians, and then as time went on, it, ironically, Christianity became the state religion of Rome. But there was a very strong time there where they were persecuting Christians horribly, and that's a time in which Revelation is written and is dealing with. So many times throughout the book of Revelation, the concept to the Christians is if you endure, you'll receive the crown of life. If you endure, there's something better, there's victory coming, the beast is going to fall, Rome is going to fall, God is still in control. And so it was a comfort to Christians who were being persecuted in that day and time to realize that, God is still in control, and this isn't always going to be. And the understanding of Revelation and the fact that it's talking about Rome and talking about some of those things is made a whole lot easier when we understand the prophecies of Daniel and realize that it's a parallel between the two. You can't study Revelation without studying Daniel and vice versa because they go hand in hand. They're both talking about the same thing at times. Good on chapter 7?
On verse 27, I wrote John 18:36.
Okay. So 27 is the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him.
18:36, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were, yeah. Okay, so that's a different study.
Ooh, that's not in the kingdom study either, but that is a really interesting study. What did Pilate just ask him?
Pilate said, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?
Okay, verse 33.
33, Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Oh, and he says, my
Did
kingdom's
Jesus
not this
claim
world.
to be king of the Jews?
No, he didn't. But then they call him that and put that on the cross, but that wasn't his claim.
They did, and it was almost a slight to the Jews. It was something the Jews would not have wanted. And I think they kind of did that out of spite. It appears that way. Jesus, we have referred to him as the king of the Jews so much, he never claimed to be king of the Jews. And even here, when they asked him, are you king of the Jews? He said, my kingdom's not of this world. It's not the king of the Jews. He's king of kings and lord of lords. He's king of all. And there's a difference between the two.
Yeah. Which I guess includes being king of the Jews. Like he's king of
It
all.
includes the Jews.
But that's just a limiting title.
It drastically limits, because that's what they were looking for. The Jews were looking for their Messiah, for their king that would allow them to reign the world. That's not what Jesus was. He was King of kings and Lord of lords. He already was king of the world, king of all, not just the king of the Jews, which is what they wanted.
Disclaimer, anytime that we've been saying, oh, that's in the kingdom study, that is a study that we're going to be doing next time. And so don't feel like you're missing out, like you've missed a study. We're referring to a study we're going to do in the future,
Yep, it will come.
just like the kingdom came.
It already has come, yeah.
Yeah.
That actually ran through my mind. Yep. Chapter 8. Chapter 8, we have the ram and the he-goat. May not be the he-goat in the New King James, but the ram and the he-goat. So this vision, and not all the visions have to fully include all four. This vision focuses only on two of them. It refers to some of the other things that the other ones have talked to, but very specifically deals with just these two kingdoms. So we look in verse 20. We're gonna start at the end and then work backwards. It says, the ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of the Media and the Persia. Who's the ram?
The king, so Cyrus, Darius.
Cyrus, Medes and Persians. We don't have to wonder who it is. It flat out tells us who this represents. 21, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. So again, it spells out who these are. It's kind of nice when you get those.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back through and look at them. If we didn't have that, it would make it quite a bit more difficult. There'd be a few more questions to ask. Timestamp in verse 1, it says, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. He said, I saw in the vision, and so it happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw there was standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will, and he became great. So we know this to be the Medo-Persian Empire because Daniel tells us, or Daniel actually is told that it's the Medo-Persian Empire. It had two horns, one higher than the other. You have the Medes and the Persians that joined forces, yet the Persians were stronger than the Medes. Do you remember the bear that was raised up on one side, that was lifted up stronger on one side? And again, the same picture. They pushed west, north, and south. You look at the Medo-Persians and look at their conquests, and you see that being shown. Nothing that could stop them, nothing that could deliver them. They were the world power of that time. Whatever they wanted to do, they did, and they were able to conquer a great amount. Kingdom began with Cyrus. God is the one who allowed Cyrus to come to power. As we looked at before, Isaiah prophesied that it would happen, and he prophesied that about 150 years before Babylon. We read about that again in Isaiah 44, verse 28, down through the first 6 or 8 verses of 45. To me, some of the most distinct and plain prophecy we have about what's going to happen in the future. Verse 5, he talks about the he-goat, the male goat. And again, the male goat is talking about the Greek Empire that we saw from verse 21. He says, As I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west and across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then came the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing by the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram, and he was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to withstand him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of the heaven. So we look at the ram and the he-goat. The male goat here came from the west, didn't touch the ground, indicating the speed. This is the speed with which Alexander the Great was able to conquer in the Greek Empire. The Persians tried to defeat the Greeks. The Medo-Persian Empire went up against the Greek Empire and tried to defeat them, but couldn't. And so you have the he-goat, the male goat, the Greek that broke two horns and left him powerless. There was no power left there in the kingdom. The goat became very strong. One horn was removed and four more came. What happened to the Greek Empire?
It was given to the four generals.
Given to the four generals. Cassander ruled over Macedonia. Lysimachus, I'm not good at Greek names, ruled over Thrace and Asia Minor. Seleucus ruled over Syria, and Ptolemy, he's probably Ptolemy, ruled over Egypt. And so you have these four emperors, generals of Alexander the Great that took over, being represented by the horn that was broken, large horn that was broken, and then four notable ones coming up after them. Verse 9 is an interesting verse. It says, and out of one of them, talking about the four horns from the empire, it says, and out of them came a little horn, which grew exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And so out of those four horns, you have one little horn that's coming up. Antiochus became king of Syria in 175 BC. His goal was to destroy the Jews, yet he was there and allowed by the power of God. He was allowed as punishment to the Jews. How many times in the Old Testament did God use wicked people to punish his people?
All the times.
All the time. And so you have Babylon, you have Assyria, you have all these different nations that, in Egypt, you have all these different nations that were allowed to be in power and allowed to punish his people. And this again is what you see happening. Let's go to verse 23. 23 is an explanation of the horn that we just read. It said, and in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fully, and he shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty, but also the holy people. So where's his power come from?
God.
Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart, and he shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and the morning which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. So he gives a little bit of an explanation of what he is talking about there at the end. Why would God tell Daniel to seal up the vision?
I guess it would be more confusing than helpful.
Was it for them?
No.
Who's it for?
The people in the time of Rome?
I'd say it was beneficial to them, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I think it's as much for us as it was for them.
I guess a prophecy is always helpful to the people who live after its fulfillment, because they can look back and be reassured that even if it's a long wait, God always fulfills what he says.
Right. Yeah, and a study of the prophecies is again, it's an amazing study, but when they received prophecies like this, and even in the days of Rome when they received revelation, it was an amazing comfort to them. It's the same comfort to us it was to them, though, because the ultimate fulfillment of the book of Revelation is, if we're faithful to God, we win. The reason there's so much discussion over which kingdom is being talked about at different times, and what does this mean, and who is this, and this sounds like this person, and this sounds like this kingdom, and this sounds like it's talking about today. And yeah, it does. And it does, because there's always a wicked world power that's going to see the judgment of God, which is what Revelation was talking about. There's always people of God who are in the minority, who are working to do what is right and working to fighting for what is right, but are struggling against a wicked world power that is. Can you name one time throughout history there wasn't a world power that was wicked?
In the beginning.
Garden of Eden?
Yeah.
I mean, it always has been. Just after the flood, I mean, you've got very limited times when there wasn't a wicked world power in existence. Are there wicked world powers today?
I would say absolutely.
For sure. For sure. Are they allowed to be there by God?
Yes.
Are they in power because God has allowed them that power?
Yeah.
Does God condone everything they do?
No. And he gives them the choice of how they're going to rule.
Right. Will God eventually punish every wicked world power?
Yes. That's the promise.
That's the promise. That's absolute, isn't it? Will he reward those who remain faithful through the wicked world powers?
Yes.
And that's also promised. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to us that it's so easy to see almost every time period in some of these prophecies, because the struggle that they face is a struggle we're still facing today. And it's not our responsibility to uproot wicked world powers. It's not our responsibility to fight against them. It's our responsibility to stay faithful to God and to realize the kingdom that we're a part of, it's not of this world. It's an eternal kingdom, and the kingdoms of this world can rise and fall. The kingdoms of this world can be wicked, and we can still be a part of the eternal righteous kingdom. And now we're starting to overlap a little too much into the kingdom. Anything else about chapter 8?
Oh, the end. But he shall be broken without human means. What?
Yeah. Who's going to destroy this Greek empire?
The Romans.
The Romans. Where'd they get their power?
I mean, ultimately God.
Ultimately, God. Did God know the Greeks were going to fall?
Yeah.
Did God set that in order?
Yeah.
Did God give Rome power?
Mm-hmm.
So even though they thought it was their own power, it wasn't by human means that this took place and this happened.
So, you think it just means that God is ultimately the reason why the Greeks fell?
I think so.
There's not anything about why the Greeks fell that had to do with not necessarily humans being the cause?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. You can talk about it.
No, I don't know. I'll have to do some research.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that. I think there's definitely a reference there to God's power being at work there and being part of it. I don't know if there's more to it or not. When it says shall not be broken without human means, literally the meaning of it is without human hands. So there may be something more there that I haven't looked at before.
I don't know. I guess we'll mention it next time if there is something.
Cool.
And man, I can relate to Daniel in in verse 27. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward, I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it.
So no one understood it. Like, how many people is he telling this to?
Who knows? Maybe all of the people working under him?
Maybe. How many of his visions did they understand?
Wasn't he the only one?
Only the ones that he explained.
Yeah.
And so he's like telling the king, "This is your dream, and this is the interpretation thereof." But then he comes down and like, "Hey, I had a dream, and I don't know what it means." It's like, well, you're the one that interprets dreams. We can't help you.
Yeah. That's funny because that must feel like such a irony, I guess, because he's like, I interpret dreams, but then he has a dream and you need someone else to be an interpreter. Or
Yeah.
I guess normally that's how it happens. And so if he's the interpreter and he has a dream, it's over for them.
Well, and yeah, and he wasn't intended to know because he's told like this refers to many days in the future. This isn't for you. Seal it up.
hmm That's so interesting. I guess
You know.
imagine being the carrier of God's message years and years, decades before it happens, just because that proves that God knows ahead of time. Like, God
Right.
could have waited until closer to the Roman Empire. He had plenty of other prophets. But he chose to give it to Daniel so that it was a for sure thing. Like, hey, this was given hundreds of years before.
So do you wonder if these world powers ever had these things pointed out to them?
Hmm. I don't know. I guess it depends on how Christian they were. Because I would think that maybe the Romans didn't have many Jews that high up to be there to be like, look at the book. But
Right.
I don't know about. I mean, Daniel was high up in some of these, so I'm sure that he told them.
Yeah.
I mean, we have it recorded a couple times where he does tell them, and they don't really like it.
Every one of these world powers, one of the things that ran constant and true through all of them was a great amount of pride. So Nebuchadnezzar, that's obvious in his life, but he went through times when he realized God was something. But there's also other times when he turned around, looked at his kingdom, and said, "Wow, look what I've done." And God reminds him, "No, you didn't. I did this for you." The more pride we have, the more difficult it is to realize we rely on God. We don't have to admit we rely on God to actually rely on Him. So you have these world powers, these world leaders who, yeah, they're proud. They think they've done this on their own. They think they are this great thing, and they're only there because God allowed it. But I highly doubt they're ready to listen to hear that. Oh, by the way, this all this conquering you're doing, God's letting you do that. God's giving that to you. Most of them consider themselves to be God. They consider themselves to be the most powerful thing in the world. Even if it's pointed out to them, I don't know that they would even listen.
Yeah.
Maybe. And I guess the full circle is making sure we don't have so much pride that we don't realize what God's trying to tell us when we read it.
Yeah. We want to be like Nineveh.
Yeah,
At that moment. We want to be like Nineveh when Jonah
at that
preached to
moment.
them. Maybe not like Nineveh the rest of the times or like later.
Yep, ready to repent. 70 weeks. All right, timestamp is here again. First year of Darius, the son of Astaraeus, the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So Daniel's reading, he's studying, and he reads of the 70 years in Jeremiah, and he asks God about these 70 years? Jeremiah 25 is where he's likely reading, and there's a couple of places. Jeremiah 25, verse 11 and 12, it says, "This whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And then it will come to pass when the 70 years are completed that I will punish the king of Babylon, and that the nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, says the Lord, and I will make a perpetual desolation." What would reading this in Jeremiah, what would that mean to Daniel?
That would mean this, like what he's talking about right here.
How long has he been in captivity? So by the time the Medes and the Persians were in power, they're knocking on the door of the 70 years. They're very close to the 70 years.
Oh, so he's hoping maybe this is it.
He's ready. He's like, okay, we get to go home. And I think he's reading this and is like, okay, God, explain this to me. Jeremiah 29 and 10 is another one. It says, "For thus says the Lord, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word towards you and cause you to return to this place." What's the promise?
That God will bring them back to Jerusalem.
Okay, so is it understandable why Daniel's like reading these things and then thinking, okay, I would like an explanation of this.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. He's reading himself into the prophecy.
He is. He is. But it's there, isn't it?
Hmm.
Verse 3, it says, "Then I set my face toward the Lord God to make request by prayer and supplication with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And I prayed to the Lord God and made confession. And I said, O Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and mercy with those who love him and with those who keep his commandments. We have sinned and committed iniquity, and we have done wickedly and rebelled, even by departing from your precepts and your judgments." What's he doing?
He's making intercession on behalf of all of his people. Even
He's
though,
on behalf of the nation as a whole.
is he including the people under the Medes and Persians?
I think he's including all of the people of Israel here.
Okay, that's what I thought too.
Yeah, but on behalf of the nation of Israel as a whole, who is in captivity at this point.
And I'm sure that Daniel sinned, but he's not one known for his sinful lifestyle. But the way that he owns the sin as if it's his own,
Yeah,
it's
well,
very humble.
can't almost any of us as a nation look at our nation and say, God, please forgive our nation?
Hmm.
There's very few righteous nations out there that are truly righteous and truly following God. Verse 6, he goes on, still talking about the nation of Israel. It says, "Neither have we listened your servants the prophets who spoke in your name to our kings and our princes and to our fathers and all the people of the land. O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us a shame of face, as it is this day, to the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and to all Israel, those near and far far off in all the countries to which you have driven them, because of the unfaithfulness which they have committed against you." And again, dealing with Israel, dealing with all of Israel who is everywhere in captivity to different places. He says, "O Lord, to us belongs shame of face, to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in his laws, which he set before us by his servants the prophets." And so he spends 5 through 10 here, verse 5 through 10, approaching God and repenting for the people. He goes down through verse 14, repenting even more for the people, still asking God for forgiveness. 15 through 19, he's asking for forgiveness in a little bit different way. He says, "And now, O Lord God, you who brought your people up out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and made yourself a name as it is this day. We have sinned and we have done wickedly. O Lord, according to all your righteousness, I pray, let your anger and your fury be turned away from your city Jerusalem and your holy mountain, because for our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and your people are a reproach to all those around us. Now therefore, our God, hear the prayer of your servant and his supplications, and for the Lord's sake, cause your face to shine on your sanctuary, which is desolate." Why does he spend all this time asking for forgiveness?
Because the reason why they're in captivity is because of them not listening to God.
They're there because of sin. Are they ready to turn back? Are they ready to repent?
Daniel is.
That's tough because Daniel is, but was Daniel ever at a place where he wasn't ready to repent?
No.
Or is he just now coming to the realization, wow, Israel was wicked and that's why God did this? I think he knew it all along.
Hmm.
Like almost any righteous person would have seen the fall of Israel and the wickedness of Israel and not wanted that to be there long before these things ever happened. I think it's also very possible that Daniel understands and knows that repentance is something that is absolutely necessary to be right with God.
Hmm.
He's wanting the nation to repent. He's wanting them to be right with God. He's wanting the 70 years to be over and wanting to be restored again. Verse 20, Gabriel gives him a little understanding here. Verse 20, it says, Now while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering, and he informed me and talked with me, and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill and give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. So you have Gabriel here in the next several verses explaining this vision that has been given, and it's 70 weeks that are determined. Verse 24, he says, For 70 weeks are determined for you, or for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression of sins and make an end of sins and make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring everlasting righteousness and to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy. 25, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood, until the end of the war of desolations are determined. Then shall he confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So a lot of things here. 70 years, and Gabriel is talking about 70 weeks. This being one of the most difficult passages in the book of Daniel,
Hmm.
this being interpreted oftentimes many different ways in looking at the 70 weeks. He's got 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and then 1 week, breaking down the 70 weeks into those divisions. So from the command to restore Jerusalem to the Messiah is 7 and 62 weeks, as it describes there. Probably this, and I'm not going to be absolute on this because, again, there's a lot of different ways to go about this, and I'm not absolutely certain on any one of them. It's probably 7 weeks from the command to restore to the building of the wall, dealing with Nehemiah and all of that situation, and then would be 62 weeks from the wall to the Messiah, to Jesus. So after 62 weeks, the Messiah is cut off, but not for himself. That's obviously describing Jesus. He was the one who was cut off, but not for himself. Isaiah 53 prophesies a lot about that as well.
Hmm.
So the final week. The final week is one of the more difficult ones, verse 26 and 27. In this final week, you have the abomination of desolations. You have sacrifice being ended, bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and the abominations, and on the wing of the abominations shall be one who makes desolate. At what point did sacrifice and offering end in Jerusalem?
Well, it should have ended at the cross.
Should have.
So it could be the week of the cross, but then also it actually ended when Jerusalem was destroyed in like, what, 80s, 70?
70. So it could be the cross. I think it more likely, I lean toward Jerusalem here, the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70. And the reason I do is because in Matthew 24, he refers, it's referred to this. Matthew 24, verse 1 and 2 says, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And he said unto them, Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say unto you that not one stone should be left upon another until they shall all be thrown down. And so he tells them that everything in there at the temple, that's all going to be destroyed, not one stone left upon another. And The fulfillment of that and the destruction of Jerusalem is really interesting study too. And so they ask him, tell us when these things will be and what will be the sign of your coming into the world. I'm fully convinced they thought that was the same question. I'm fully convinced they thought that at the time that those things would be, when the temple is destroyed, that has to be the end of the world.
Hmm.
But Jesus answers it in two different sections here in chapter 24. He answers when the temple will be destroyed, and he also answers when the end of the world will be. We go down to verse 15. Verse 15, he tells them about this, and at this point he's prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem and about what's going to happen there. And he tells them, he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. So
Hmm.
he tells them here in Matthew 24, in dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem, he tells them, when you see the abomination of desolations standing in the holy place, that's when you leave. At this point, he's not dealing with crucifixion.
Right. This is definitely talking about Jerusalem.
This is definitely Jerusalem, and he's tying the abomination of desolation from Daniel to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Hmm.
And so this is why I lean strongly towards this last week being the period of time from the death of Christ until Jerusalem is destroyed. Does it cause us issues that he calls them weeks instead of years?
Well, all of this is allegorical, metaphorical, so I don't know why we would take that literally, but not anything else.
If it was years, would it be literal?
Mm, I'm not sure.
Like almost nothing else we've looked at in Daniel 7 through the end, almost none of that is literal. And so even if we take it as years, it's not literal. It's a lot more than 70 years from the time that he's talking about into the destruction. It's 70 years from the birth of Jesus to the destruction of Jerusalem. If it would have said years instead of weeks, it still
It
couldn't have
still
been
would have
literal.
been, yeah.
And so when we look at this, it's figurative, but this is a different kind of literature than absolute literal literature. Was there literally a lion with wings that had the body as a man?
No.
No, and we know that. We understand that. And so a lot of people run into issues because the issues come when we try to take some things as literal and some things as figurative. And so the 70 weeks here, it plays into three definite time frames and works very nicely in those three time frames as long as we don't take the weeks as literal weeks. The weeks are periods of time and periods of time that he's talking about. You got to keep in mind too, this was given at a time when Darius is king over the Medes, Cyrus is king over the Persians. So you have Darius and Cyrus both ruling together at this time. Cyrus had issued a decree to allow the Jews to return home that already had been in the works and already been done. We looked at that earlier. Ezra 1, 1 and 2 is where it's recorded. They're just coming out of 70 years of Babylonian captivity. And so while the prophecies that he's reading in Jeremiah, that Daniel is reading about the 70 years in Jeremiah, that 70 years is coming to an end. And then you have Gabriel come and tell him about these other periods of time that are yet to come. And all of these visions are symbolic, from the sea to the wind to the goats to the animals to the numbers that are given. Even the numbers that are given are symbolic. Therefore, 70 weeks is very likely symbolic as well. There's been some efforts to make it fit literally, but I think it makes the most sense being symbolic and talking about these three periods of time ending with the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah. And it makes sense. It's a short time, and then a long time, and then a really short time.
Right. Yep. And all three of those fit. So Daniel,
So,
that's a
Daniel,
very summary of the vision, very short summary of the visions.
can we go? I don't even know if I've talked to you about this. Maybe you told me. But when is it when the angel is sent? Daniel prays to learn about it. The angel is sent, and then later on, the angel comes and he finds out that there was like a spiritual battle going on, and that's why the angel was delayed in coming and answering his prayer.
I know what you're talking about. Is it Daniel?
Yes, and it's so cool when you read it, but I'm trying to think of when it was.
I've come across that a time or two, not in my Daniel studies that I actually dug into that. So that's been a more recent thing that I ran across that.
I think I studied it once when I was doing a commentary study on Daniel.
You got Gabriel a couple times. 10:13 or 10:10.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so where does it start? It starts in. I guess we can just keep going because we just ended in 9. In chapter 10, Daniel mourns for 3 full weeks, ate no food, so he's really sad. And then he looks up, he sees a man in clothed in linen, body like beryl, don't know what that is. His face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torch of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze in color, and the sound of the words like a voice of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. And when I was left alone, I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me, for my vigor was turned to frailty in me. I retained no strength, yet I heard the sound of the words. And while I heard the sound of his words, I was in a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. Suddenly a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. While he was speaking this to me, I stood trembling. Then he said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. So here he says, the reason why I've come is because from the very first day that you set your heart to understand. And when did he pray? That was like 2 chapters in the first year of Darius. He prayed to God and made confessions, and that was whenever he prayed for forgiveness and everything. So he asked to understand that revelation and stuff in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus. And then in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia,
Right.
I don't know how much time that is between that.
So they ruled together. They ruled at the same time, Darius and Cyrus.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know exactly how much time, but they should have come to power at the same time, which would have been the end of chapter 5.
So like 2 years later, Daniel gets this message.
Probably.
And
Yep.
the angel says, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. Now I've come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. So
Right.
the first time I noticed that, I was like, no way. We don't think about the stuff going on spiritually behind the scenes, I guess. And I don't know how much we should be thinking of this literally, but because of the description in verse 5 through 7, I don't think that this was a human.
Right.
And so thinking about a messenger from God, an angel, being with the kings and being held up, I don't even know what that means. Like, how does that even happen? But the fact that because Daniel had prayed and had wanted to do this and was so persistent in his confessions and in his prayers and stuff, God sent the answer. But Daniel didn't know that he was going to get the answer until 2 years later.
Right.
But from the very first day that he prayed it, his answer was sent.
Right. So yeah, is it obviously God knew all that was going to happen? Is it possible the angel didn't?
Yeah.
And I think it happened on God's time frame and the way God wanted. Would God have had the capability of sending another angel?
Yeah.
But he let this happen.
Yeah, he did.
As far as exactly what happened, I believe it happened. I know it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not about to try to explain it.
Yeah. No idea. But I just think that from that, I've learned that maybe I'm praying for something or asking God for something. And from the moment I started praying about it, he sent an answer. But I can't see the spiritual things going on to send the answer. It might not come right that moment, but it's on its way.
So is it the case that the kingdom of Persia withstood him 21 days? Is it the case the kingdom of Persia was not spiritually ready for this to happen?
Yeah.
For Daniel to know? Is it the case that these things had to be accomplished in this order before Daniel could be explained exactly what that was talking about? Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But then another angel comes to help him. What does that
Yeah.
even mean? Like, how are they helped in fighting the kingdom of Persia to get to Daniel? I don't know. That is, That is just something that makes me think more of a spiritual reality that I don't often think of. Like, I think in the physical as we do as humans, and the things that God is doing is in the spiritual realm. And so
Right.
we can't always see what's going on. But the fact that that's recorded here kind of gives us some insight as to everything is not always as it seems.
Right. Well, and the answer for us is absolute and is there. And it may not come on our time, but it may be the case that it's on its way.
Hmm. Yeah. I really like that. And
Yeah.
I've never heard a sermon on it or anything, but I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, and it would be an interesting thing to talk about in a sermon, but it's just, again, it's just so difficult to say, yep, this is absolutely what happened.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we're supposed to know.
The encouragement in it isn't what happened, it's that
Exactly.
something was happening.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Yep.
As we wrap up this episode of the Lydia Todd Pod, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude for you spending time with me. This really challenges my belief that I only have 5 consistent listeners. If you have any thoughts, topics, or questions you'd like me to explore further on future episodes, please reach out on one of my socials. I hope that our conversations have brought you inspiration and joy. If you have friends or family who might be interested in our conversations, don't hesitate to share the podcast with them.